Hey guys, tonight we're kicking things off with a topic that's a little less mathematical than usual, but incredibly useful if you ever find yourself without electricity, running water, or a clear idea of modern plumbing. Yes, we're talking about medieval survival skills. But before you get comfortable, take a second to like and subscribe only if you really like what I'm doing here. And leave a comment letting me know where you're watching from and what time it is where you are. I always find it fascinating to see people from all over the world watching, probably while stocking up on dried beans. Now dim the lights, turn on the fan for some nice background noise, and let's get going tonight. In medieval times, fire wasn't a convenience, it was survival. It warmed, cooked, lit, protected, and sometimes was the only companion during a week-long storm in a thatched hut. When people left home, they didn't take snacks. They took fire. Enter the walking fire, the medieval version of the Zippo. If the Zippo was slow, smelled like sheep, and dangerous enough to burn down your wagon if you weren't careful, so how did it work? People took embers from their home fires, usually charcoal, wrapped them in dry moss, hard mushrooms, or slow-burning rotten wood, and stuffed them into a hollow horn or fireproof leather bag. Sometimes they used linen soaked in brimstone or animal fat to keep the embers burning longer. The embers could smolder for hours, even days, and flare up with a little blow, like the way you need a pep talk after receiving your tax bill in the village. Lightweight, reusable, and invaluable, this fire bundle saves you the pain of knocking on rocks for half an hour to create a spark and pretend you know what you're doing. Starting a fire is a pain if the tinder is damp or your hands are freezing cold. But carrying a fire means you can walk into a forest pitch, a tent, unwrap the magic moss, and with a little puff and a prayer to Saint Smoky, you can make soup, warm yourself, or perform a spooky shadow puppet show. You can even pass the fire bundle to a neighbor on your way to the market, literally passing the fire, because no one wants to be the one asking for a fire at dusk. It's easy to get the Gerald, "You should have brought the moss" sarcasm. If you've ever seen a modern prepper's pantry, it's a museum of vacuum-packed hope. Jerky beans, cans of exotic foods from 2011, and a dozen dried stroganoff noodles that would last through the apocalypse and still be complaining. And medieval people. They preserved meat the old-fashioned way, smoking, salting, and the lingering fear that there would be nothing to eat in February. Today, when we think of smoking, we imagine grills, cold beer, and the illusion of light BBQ. But for medieval people, smoke wasn't for flavor, it was for survival. And not just any smoke. They used pine smoke, stealth smoke, a heavy, characterful smoke. In small huts with open fires, meat wasn't hung directly over the fire as in sci-fi, but hidden behind, high up on the roof, away from animals, children, and the neighbor who always came to eat. Why behind the fire? Because that's where the cool smoke creeps in, slowly, evenly enveloping every piece of chicken or pork you've worked so hard to obtain. Over weeks, even months, the smoke dries, the meat kills bacteria, repels insects, and keeps it alive longer than your New Year's resolution. It's not the sweet, sweet smoke of baked apples. It's the smoke of despair, thick, pungent, and effective. After a few months, the meat becomes tough, dark, and almost impervious to everything, from bacteria to unexpected relatives. It's also hard to steal, which is important in a village where I don't see any sausages hanging anywhere, is a legitimate argument. Smoking meat has a double benefit. As the meat cooks slowly, the house is warmer, and there are fewer insects. There's nothing like sitting under a smoking piece of meat on a medieval evening in a room filled with smoke and hope. Modern survivalists love perimeter defenses, motion sensors, trip wires, flying cameras, and that friend who insists his dog can smell a thief a mile away. But medieval people had their own defense system, no batteries, no dogs, no Wi-Fi. They called it a living fence. It's exactly what it sounds like, a fence that grows. Instead of using logs, nails, or yells to keep cows in their yards, they planted trees like willows, hawthorns, hazels, or black apples close together. As the trees grew, they weren't allowed to grow straight, but instead were bent, woven, and twisted into dense hedges that deter pigs, divert geese, and make thieves cry. Some hedges were cut in half and bent, and the trees lived and grew. The thorny ones both deter thieves and produce fruit if you have the hands to handle them. And the best part, living hedges get stronger. Unlike rotten wooden hedges that need repair, hedgerows grow thicker and denser every year. They're not just walls, they're biological fortresses. Birds nest, bees gather honey, the soil doesn't erode. A medieval all-purpose tool. If it has thorns, bees, and the occasional weasel hiding in it, it's a good one. And beautiful. Many living hedges in Britain have survived more than 700 years through wars, kings, and several Brexits. When you hear clay batteries, you might think of monks in pointy hats, electrocuting frogs, or ancient farmers accidentally inventing Tesla. But no, these batteries aren't for generating electricity. They're for storing heat. Long before air conditioning, mini fridges, or climate concerns. Clay isn't just for making pots or puzzling artwork. It's a quiet genius in thermodynamics. In short, it holds heat or cold very well, like grandma holds grudges. The ancients lined their cisterns, walls, and jars with clay to keep food cool in the summer and warm in the winter. No science fiction. Just physics plus mud. They stored milk, butter, and soup in unglazed earthenware jars. As the water evaporated from the surface, it cooled the inside. A kind of medieval refrigerator. No noise, no chemicals, and no weird smells. They even buried their jars in the ground or in cool cellars, using the constant temperature of the ground to preserve food, and sometimes even grandma's spare apple pies. They also heated clay bricks near a fire and used them to bug spray. This is genius. It's low-tech, low-cost, and most importantly, bug-free. And because herbs are easy to grow or forage, even the poorest households can afford to protect their sleep with the medieval equivalent of scented booby traps. Some families even develop their own herbal blends passed down as family heirlooms against scratching sleepiness. If your great-grandmother's mattress smelled strongly of rosemary and regret, she probably knew exactly what she was doing. Of course, the scent fades, the bugs return, and eventually you'll rip your bedding apart in the moonlight, like a desperate apothecary in a fit of rage. But at least for a while, you can fall asleep to the comforting scent of medieval pest control. Now, speaking of stuffing, let's talk about another underrated wonder, the scented ball. Think of it as the medieval version of an air freshener combined with a personal defense orb. These were small balls or containers filled with aromatic herbs, resins, and sometimes a bit of mystery spice carried or worn by people who wanted to survive the stench of crowded markets, chamber pots, and a guy who hadn't showered since the last harvest. Pomanders weren't just fashionable, they were functional. People actually believed that disease spread through bad smells, so walking around with a miniature garden and a metal orb was considered smart health policy. They were made of silver, brass, carved wood, or bone, and often contained strong scents like cloves, cinnamon, frankincense. And since this was the Middle Ages, probably something that made you sneeze violently. You'd hang your scented orb from a belt or chain, or tuck it into your cloak. That way, when someone around you smells like medieval rot, you can just take a deep breath of your scented ball and pretend life isn't so bad. Nobles had elaborate carved versions. Peasants made simpler cloth bundles of herbs. But the idea is the same: survive the stench, avoid the plague, and smell faintly like an embalmed spice rack while you do it. Even in death, the power of scent lingers. Bodies were stuffed with herbs to prevent decomposition, or at least mask it, and graves were sometimes lined with fragrant plants. Because whether you're trying to ward off lice disease, or just your cousin Gerald with never-ending garlic breath, the strategy is clear. If it smells strong enough, it must be doing something right. So the next time you light a candle or spritz some air freshener, remember your medieval ancestors. They didn't have Febreze. They had wormwood desperation and a desperate desire not to be eaten alive in their sleep. Farm. But back in the Middle Ages, before refrigerators and Instagram-worthy butter dishes, people had to make do with what they had. And that often involved salt, cool air, and a respect for spoilage. Enter the surprisingly delicate world of medieval butter preservation. The first step, salt. Lots of salt. Butter was salted not just for flavor, but also because salt draws out moisture and inhibits bacterial growth. This turns regular butter into a longer-lasting version that can last for days or even weeks without turning into something your goats won't touch. The saltier the butter, the longer it will last, though it can also serve as a medieval exfoliant if you're not careful. Once salted, the butter was sealed tightly in ceramic jars, wooden barrels, or animal stomachs if you were both desperate and practical. These containers were then sealed with a layer of salt melted lard, or even wax to keep out air and curious insects. In winter, it might be buried outside where the cold ground acted as a natural freezer. In summer, it lived in the coldest corner of the house, often next to reliable stone shelves, or inside clay jars half buried in moist soil. If you were lucky enough to own a spring house, a small structure built over a flowing stream, you had one of the best butter-storing devices money could buy. The constant cold water kept the air inside cool and moist, perfect for preserving perishables like buttermilk and that weird, soft cheese your cousin made last Lent. Of course, not all butter survived. Sometimes it went rancid. When that happened, it wasn't always thrown away. No, it could be reboiled, resalted, or in some horrifying cases reused as lamp fuel. Because if your butter can no longer improve your bread, it can at least improve your light. Medieval efficiency at its finest. And here's the thing. Medieval people loved butter. It wasn't just a spread, it was a food group, a cooking fat, a commodity, even a religious argument. During Lent, for example, butter was sometimes banned. This, as you can imagine, caused quite a stir. Take the butter tower, a real thing in some churches, built from indulgences paid by the wealthy to be allowed to continue using butter during Lent. Imagine having part of a cathedral built because you refuse to fry eggs in oil. That's the butter pledge. So next time you accidentally throw a stick of butter into the grocery cart, remember your medieval ancestors had to stir it by hand. Carefully salt it, bury it under a rock, and fight off a raccoon just to enjoy a smear of it on their rye bread. And even then, it probably tasted a little muddy. But it was theirs. It was butter. And in the medieval world, that meant something. What about hair? Hair is a living sculpture. In ancient China, women's hairstyles were more than just a fashion statement. They were a biography. Each twist, roll, and pin told a story, your age, your marital status, even your moral standing. Young girls wore simple braids or buns, but as you came of age, usually around 15, your hair was styled into elaborate buns with pins, combs, and ornaments made of jade gold or carved wood. These were more than just accessories. They were talismans of status and elegance. Some hairstyles were so elaborate they required assistance, and some had the kind of volume that hairstylists today can only dream of. Washing your hair was less frequent, but highly ritualistic. It included special herbs like heishou tea or rice water that were said to nourish the scalp, strengthen hair, and slow the graying process. And when it turned gray, no problem. Black hair dye was popular among both men and women, using natural mixtures made from walnut shells, indigo, or even squid ink. Scent wasn't just vanity, it was virtue. In Confucian thought, maintaining a pleasant scent was a form of respect for those around you. Women tucked sachets of dried flowers and aromatic herbs like osmanthus chrysanthemum or cloves into their sleeves, hair, or underwear. Some even sprayed perfume on their hairpins or combs. A delicate scent trail left in the garden wasn't just a romantic image, it was a cultivated art. And their beauty wasn't just for others. The influence of Taoism and Buddhism teaches that physical harmony reflects inner balance. Rituals are not just about looking good. They are acts of self-discipline, mindfulness, and spiritual cultivation. Jade rollers are not just skin care, they are meditation. Blush is not just color, it is energy drawn to the surface. So while Roman women might poison themselves for glamour, and Mesopotamians wore eyeliner to ward off both evil and sunlight, Chinese women practiced beauty that combined aesthetics, philosophy, and medicine into one powerful, silent routine. From bark bread to marsh butter, cabbage leaf bandages to jade facial rollers, the ancients were not primitive. They were resourceful, observant, and sometimes, to be honest, a little desperate. But what they lacked in modern technology, they made up for in ingenuity. Beauty, health, and survival aren't separate categories, they're intertwined in everyday life. And while we may no longer tattoo our eyebrows with soot or dig butter out of a swamp, it's worth remembering they don't do it for Instagram. They do it to live, and sometimes to live beautifully. Pale skin wasn't just fashionable in ancient Greece, it was also a sign of upper-class status. A tan meant you had to work in the sun like a common peasant or slave. The aristocratic ideal was a pale moon, smooth and unaffected by the harsh elements. To achieve this, women and sometimes men applied white liner or foundation to their faces. The risk of poisoning, absolutely. But like all ancient beauty, the divine look was worth the risk of a few side effects. To soften and cleanse their skin, the Greeks used olive oil, their golden elixir. Mixed with fine sand or ash, it acted as a gentle exfoliant. They then shaved it off with a strigil, a curved metal blade used for both hygiene and exercise. The result: smooth, radiant skin and a keen understanding of friction. As for fragrance, the Greeks pioneered the use of perfume as an art form. Oils infused with myrrh, cinnamon, or marjoram were applied to the body daily, not just to smell good, but to honor the gods who loved to seduce and mask the very human smells of everyday life. Perfume was not frivolous. It was a social imperative, a spiritual offering, and a sign of the senses. Hair was also a matter of pride and identity. Greek women often wore their hair long and elaborately styled, pinned up with brass or ivory combs, sometimes braided or rolled in elaborate braids. Light hair was favored, so a mixture of vinegar, herbs, and sun exposure bleached it blonde, prefiguring 1,000 years of peroxide experimentation. Men, by contrast, kept things simpler. Beards were neatly trimmed, and short-styled hair symbolized both maturity and control. A slovenly appearance was considered suspect or worse, barbaric. Even philosophers who were not known for their charm prided themselves on neat grooming. Socrates may have questioned everything, but not the value of a good liniment. Makeup was subtle, almost invisible. Blush made from crushed berries or red ochre added a subtle flush. Eyes might be rimmed with soot or coal borrowed from Eastern traditions. But overall, the aesthetic was restrained, natural, and deeply symbolic. Beauty balanced with nature, not in competition with it. And of course, symmetry. The Greeks believed that perfect facial and body proportions reflected the harmony of the universe. This is why their statues of gods, athletes, even philosophers were mathematically idealized. Beauty is not vanity. It is a virtue, an outward expression of inner order, discipline, and wisdom. So while later civilizations filled themselves with powders, potions, and perfumes in pursuit of charm, the ancient Greeks pursued arete, excellence, both of body and soul. Their beauty did not scream. It whispered, "I am in harmony with the divine." In the ancient Greek world, pale skin was more than just an aesthetic trend. It was a symbol of nobility and leisure. A tanned face meant you had to work outdoors. It was associated with slaves or peasants. So Greek women pursued a dewy beauty ideal, porcelain white skin. To achieve this, they used powders made from white lead chalk or even crushed seashells. These powders were not gentle. In fact, many women applied them so thickly that when they smiled, their faces cracked like plaster. But for them, beauty meant sacrifice. Red lips and cheeks were made up with mulberries, red iron oxide, or even wine dregs. The darker the red, the more seductive the look. However, the makeup had to be used in moderation. Too much makeup was considered indecent. A little blush was enough to indicate health and purity. If overdone, one could easily be compared to the hetairae, the famous courtesans of the time who used dazzling cosmetics to attract philosophers and politicians at banquets. Hair care was never a small matter. Greek women favored long, wavy hair, often braided bunned or braided into elaborate styles, secured with ivory or copper pins. To lighten their hair, they used vinegar, lemon juice, and sometimes ash. Blonde hair, especially hair as light as that of Helen of Troy, was considered divine and alluring. Therefore, the nobility did not hesitate to use wigs or hair extensions from northern slave women. Both a luxury and a sign of status, eyebrows, seemingly trivial, were a big highlight. A pair of unbroken eyebrows called unibrows was seen as a sign of intelligence and purity. Women who did not have natural makeup would add antimony powder or charcoal or even glue goat hair between their eyebrows to create a soft scholar effect. The most popular intellectual beauty. Perfume was also an indispensable part. The Greeks were very meticulous in their perfume preparation. Olive oil as a base combined with herbs such as thyme, marjoram, and orris root, creating a delicate scent. They applied perfume after bathing, a habit that was almost ritualistic. The ancient Greeks bathed frequently and in public not only to clean themselves, but also to preserve purity, both body and soul. For them, cleanliness is near to the gods. In the jungles and highlands of Mesoamerica, beauty was not a soft thing. In the Aztec and Maya civilizations, beauty was a sign of courage, divinity, and power. The body was more than just a physical form. It was a marker of social status, beliefs, and religious devotion. Most notable was the practice of cranial deformation. From birth, children were bound to wooden boards to flatten and elongate their skulls into a near conical shape. This was a sign of nobility, intelligence, and ideal beauty. The steeper and smoother the forehead, the higher the social status. Next came the art of dental decoration. The Maya, especially the upper class, drilled holes in their teeth and set them with precious stones such as jade, hematite, or turquoise. The tool, razor-sharp obsidian. The result, a sparkling smile. The pain, impossible. Even teeth were sharpened or shaped symmetrically, symbols of strength and connection to the gods. Skin and face painting were also an essential part of life and ritual. Aztec women often painted their cheeks red or yellow, while men and women used black paint in ceremonies. Each color had a meaning: red for life and fertility, black for war or piety. Some were extracted from LAC beetles, giving them a bright red hue. Piercings and tattoos were a spiritual commitment. Ears, noses, and lips were often pierced with jade or bone. Tattoos carved with thorns and ink represented lineage, religious roles, or victories on the battlefield. They were not adornments. They were declarations to gods like Quetzalcoatl or Ixchel. Even cross-eyedness was considered beautiful. In Mayan culture, mothers would hang beads in front of their newborn babies' noses to train their eyes to turn inward, creating a congenital, cross-eyed appearance. But no one sees that as a defect. On the contrary, it is a sign of spiritual ability, of a vision that transcends the world. A high hairstyle is more than just fashion. It's a symbol of royalty. In West Africa, in the lands of the ancient Yoruba and Songhai, people's body painting with indigo and ochre pigments played an important role in rituals and festivals. Tribal markings, whether tattooed or painted, were not seen as flaws, but as a mark of beauty, a symbol of strength and ancestral heritage. But beauty has never been free. It always required something: time, effort, wealth, and sometimes health, reason, even life. In the ancient world, the pursuit of beauty often entered dangerous territory. While these beauty rituals were admired and revered, the consequences often ran deeper than skin deep. We've seen the creepy stuff lead arsenic, mercury, crushed insects, all of which have made their way into cosmetics and skincare products. The common thread, they're all poisons. White lead powder, once used in Rome, Greece, and Renaissance Europe, caused hair loss, muscle paralysis, and organ failure over time. Yet the whiter your skin, the more attractive you were, considered a compliment wrapped in poison. In ancient China, foot binding began early and later became the norm during the great dynasties. Lotus feet, small, curved, and neat, were considered the height of grace and obedience. Though permanently disfiguring, it wasn't seen as cruel, but as a sign of ideal beauty. The physical pain of tattooing, piercing, and body modification, from the Maya and Aztecs' implantation of gems in their teeth to the shaping of skulls in infancy, all carried the value of honor and reverence for the gods. But the risk of infection and injury was extremely high. In ancient Africa and the Middle East, tattoo scars were symbols of beauty and power, done by cutting the skin into intricate patterns, without anesthesia or antiseptics. Even fragrant things like perfume could be dangerous. In ancient Egypt, scented headgear, made from wax mixed with aromatic resins such as cinnamon, frankincense, and lotus, melted in the heat to release its scent. But high concentrations of cinnamon could burn the skin. Furthermore, when bathing in water was a luxury, people used strong-smelling perfumes to clean, which inadvertently retained dirt and bacteria, easily causing skin infections. Ancient cosmetics were not controlled or standardized. Beauty secrets can be one person's savior, another's death sentence. Misinformation often spreads by word of mouth or is recorded in esoteric texts. Misunderstanding and vanity coexist. In every civilization, the pursuit of beauty reflects larger values: power, divinity, status, virtue. But the price is often paid in silence. Scars are hidden under white powder, perfumes are intoxicating, and hair is lavishly combed. Long before monopoly ruined modern family dinners, ancient Mesopotamians were fascinated with board games, specifically one called the Royal Game of Ur. The game was discovered in the 1920s by British archaeologist Sir Leonard Woolley in the Royal Cemetery at Ur. It dates back more than 4,500 years, not just for fun, but as a sacred, perhaps even cosmological symbol. The board is a work of art, a small rectangle of 20 squares decorated with lapis lazuli shells and red limestone set in bitumen. It looks more like a sacred relic than a toy. Players use tetrahedral dice, a four-sided pyramid, to move their pieces with the goal of getting all 7 of their pieces off the board before their opponents. It sounds simple, but the game has many layers of meaning. Some scholars believe that the layout of the board represents a spiritual journey, a metaphor for the soul's journey through fate and chaos. The squares in the middle are risky or sacred, places where players are tested or protected. Winning is not just about luck, but about navigating the chaos of the universe like threading a needle through the will of the gods. The game was also used for divination. Clay tablets record priests using dice rolls to decipher omens, turning the game into a form of tarot and backgammon. Traces of the game have also appeared in India and Egypt, suggesting it spread along trade routes, becoming the first international game before chess or Go. In ancient Egypt, there was a similar game called senet, but it was not just a pastime, it was a passport to the afterlife. Dating back to 3100 BC, senet was depicted in tomb paintings, literary texts, and carved on the thighs of pharaohs like Tutankhamun. The senet board had 30 squares arranged in 3 rows of 10. Each player had 5 or 7 pieces and had to move them across the board to leave the last square safely. The pieces were moved using sticks or bones, like ancient dice. But luck wasn't everything. Strategy and timing were also important. From a light-hearted game, senet became a ritual that simulated the soul's journey through the underworld. Each move was a sacred choice, and winning could symbolize overcoming the challenge of death to reach eternity. By 1550 BCE, during the New Kingdom of Egypt, the game of senet had moved beyond the realm of family entertainment. It had become a sacred ritual, reenacting the soul's journey through the duat, the Egyptian underworld. Each square on the board was no longer simply a playing position, but rather represented important stages in the spiritual journey. Rebirth, judgment, danger, purification. Each turn was no longer a game of chance. It was an invocation of the divine will. The symbols and imagery surrounding the game became increasingly mystical. Some boards were inscribed with hieroglyphs representing guardian deities or protective charms. For example, Square 26 often represented the House of Rebirth, while Square 27 was the House of Happiness. Stopping there could bring protection from the gods. But other squares represented delays, dangers, or challenges. The board became a miniature model of the afterlife, a spiritual racetrack built of cedar and sacred colors. Senet was also associated with the goddess Ma'at, the embodiment of truth, justice, and cosmic order. Playing senet well was also a symbolic rehearsal for the trials after death, where the soul would be weighed against Ma'at's feather. Win and you could be immortal. Lose, and you had better hope someone buried a few amulets with you. So although it may seem like the ancestor of backgammon or chess senet was more than just a game, it was a prayer, a map to guide the soul to eternity. In Egypt, people didn't just play senet, they prayed through it. And in ancient Greece, a seemingly simple game, knucklebones, had unexpected layers of meaning. At first glance, it seems like a child's game, a handful of bones thrown up and caught. But in reality, it is a game of skill, chance, romance, and divine symbolism. In bustling squares or quiet temple courtyards, the sound of bones hitting stones echoes. Laughter, competition, and ritual all blend together. Originally, the game used the ankle bones of sheep or goats called astragaloi. Unlike modern dice, these four-sided bones bounce unevenly, making each throw a mystery. Players had to catch them with the back of their hands or reach certain positions to score points. Not only children played, but adults too, especially women. On ceramic vases and sculptures, one can see graceful girls in traditional long dresses, their faces intent playing knucklebones as a social ritual combined with a game of dexterity. Sometimes a beautiful throw could stop a passing boy in his tracks. But deeper still, there is a spiritual element. Each side of the bone had its own name and numerical value, turning the game into a tool for divination. A good throw was considered a sign of Apollo or Hermes, and if all four sides matched it, was a Venus throw. Perfect lucky, said to have been touched by the gods. The game was also associated with death and the afterlife. The dice were buried with the dead as toys or divination tools in the afterlife. Some believed that the soul would continue to play with them or use them to predict the future. Gradually, the bones were replaced by bronze, glass, and ivory. But the essence remained the same: easy to learn, difficult to master, and always mysterious. In Greece, knucklebones were not just a game. They were flirtation, fate, and fun, all wrapped up in one toss. In the Roman Empire, the game was no longer about luck. It was about strategy. If chess was war on a board, then ludus latrunculorum was the Roman declaration of war. Also known as latrunculi, or little soldier's game, it was not simply a game played in a villa courtyard. It was a battle of wits, a simulation of real war. The exact rules of latrunculi have been lost, but the surviving wooden pieces, clay pieces, and literary sources give us a pretty good idea. The board was a grid, maybe 8x8 or 10x10, with each player controlling a troop of soldiers called latrones, mercenaries. The goal to surround and capture the enemy. There were no dice, no luck, just strategy. This game was not a race for speed like Senet or Hounds. It was a battlefield where psychology, bait, and traps were everything, just like a real military campaign. Writers like Varro and Ovid mentioned it as a pastime for soldiers and senators alike. Some saw it as a test of character. Others simply enjoyed humiliating their friends in public. The game was not just for the nobility. Boards were carved into stone floors and even roofs throughout the Roman Empire, from Britain to Egypt. Soldiers played while encamped merchants played at the marketplace. It transcended class barriers, becoming a popular yet profound game. The pieces varied from pebbles carved ivory to colored glass. Some boards had special squares which could be fortresses or thrones, where important captures took place. With or without a king, like in chess, the game emphasized ruthless logic over brute force. Roman poets also used the latrunculi as a metaphor for politics. Losing a soldier meant losing the favor of the court. Being surrounded meant betrayal at court. Even the gods were said to have played a version of the game, suggesting that strategy was not just a human skill, but a divine one. While the ludus latrunculorum may have died out, its spirit lives on in chess, Go, and modern strategy games. For the Romans, it was a bloody intellectual sport, where winning was not just about bragging rights. It was about asserting superior intellect. But before Senet became a legendary game in ancient Egypt, there was another game, Mahen, also spelled Mayhen, a mysterious board game with a spiraling shape named after its guardian snake god. Mahen was more than a pastime. It was a puzzle wrapped in mythology, strategy, and ritual. Mahen's board was distinctive, a giant snake coiled into rectangles that spiraled inward toward its head. In mythology, the snake Mahen protects the sun god Ra on his nightly journey through the underworld. Thus, each game of Mahen is a simulation of a divine journey where players must navigate twists and turns of peril, transformation, and rebirth. The pieces found with the board include small marbles or stones and small lion symbols. Scholars believe that each player controls a group of marbles moving across the snake's body, perhaps escorted or threatened by the lions. The lions may be protectors' obstacles or even attackers of their opponents. The method of movement is unclear, but it is likely related to dice or counting sticks, as in many other Egyptian games. What makes Mehen even more mysterious is its sudden disappearance. Popular during the Old Kingdom, 2600–2300 BC, Mehen has almost completely disappeared from records and archaeology by the Middle Kingdom. Why, no one knows. Some theories suggest that the game's religious significance was lost. Others suggest that Mehen was simply overshadowed by Senet's growing importance in funerals and rituals. Whatever the reason, Mehen has become a relic, a ghost left behind by its beautiful snake boards and mute lion-headed pieces. Even more intriguingly, similar spiral boards have been found in Cyprus and the Levant, suggesting that the game or its iconography spread through trade or conquest. In those faraway lands, did the game retain its mythological significance? Or was it simply a strange puzzle the evidence is lacking? But it is precisely this ambiguity that adds to Mehen's appeal. At its core, Mehen is more than a game. It is a journey on the back of a serpent god, a metaphor for protection, adventure, and the endless cycle of life, death, and rebirth. Every move is an echo in the legend. Farther north, before the Vikings wrote sagas or carved runes, they played Tafel, an asymmetrical game that reflected the harsh world of piracy, sieges, and survival. From the frozen longhouses of Norway to the trading ports of Ireland, variations of Tafel spread across the Nordic world, sharpening the mind as much as the weapon. This was no light pastime. It was miniature warfare steeped in strategy, deception, and risk. The most famous version was Hnefa Tafel, or King's Board. On a square board of varying sizes, usually 11x11 or 13x13, the king and his small bodyguards were placed in the center, while a large army of attackers surrounded the board. The king's task was to escape to a corner of the board, while the enemy had to completely surround it. No dice, no luck. Logic, planning, and positional pressure. As in real Viking raids, the odds are unfair, forcing the king to move like a desperate leader, constantly dodging, counter-attacking, and scheming. Tafel boards are usually carved from wood antlers or stone with intricately carved squares and pieces. Nobles can own glass or bone versions with lifelike carvings of kings, warriors, and dragons. The boards can be easily carried on warships, fitting the Viking way of life. Despite regional variations, the pulse of Tafel is always conflict. It is not simply entertainment, but a leadership training tool teaching people to retreat at the right time, make necessary sacrifices, and think a few steps ahead. In a world where alliances change like the wind on the bay, the ability to read the intentions of the enemy is a matter of survival. Tafel was so deeply rooted in Nordic culture that Christian missionaries used it to reach pagans, replacing the king with a bishop in their modified versions. But as chess spread into medieval Scandinavia, Tafel gradually became seen as a relic of pagan times. By the 12th century, it was all but extinct, though its echoes lived on in regional games like tablan. In its heyday, Tafel was more than a game. It was a miniature battlefield, quieter, cleaner, and bones were used instead of blood. In the palaces of ancient India, amid the procession of elephants, incense, and chanting, there was a game that was not just for fun, but for contemplating fate. It was Pachisi, known as the national soul of India, where ritual, royalty, and karma converged on the chessboard. Originating in the 6th century AD or earlier, Pachisi was a favorite of the great emperor Akbar. He doesn't just play, he lives the game. The board is shaped like a cross, symbolizing the 4 directions and the intersection of fate. Each cross is a path for the pieces, forming a circular journey where players bring their pieces to the center to win. Pachisi is more than just a game. It is a cosmic dance of karma, power, and calculated risk. The cross-shaped board represents the universe, the 4 directions, and the cycle of fate, with each path leading to squares, where the pieces move based on the roll of the dice. The dice are made of shells or bones, and each move represents luck or challenge. The game requires players to combine dexterity with strategy, predict their opponents, and take risks. Akbar the Great is said to have played Pachisi with pieces made of precious jade on a giant carpeted board in the palace. Pachisi became a symbol of power, where players fought and expressed their destiny through each move. In the East, ancient China also had games that reflected deep philosophy and daily life. The most prominent was Go, also known as Weiqi. Go is not a game of chance, but is based entirely on strategy, patience, and space control. The 19x19 square board represents an infinite world where 2 players use white and black stones to gain control of the territory. Each piece is like a soldier. Each move is a step on the military and philosophical path. Players must know how to lose, know how to win, and at the same time have a vision like a master strategist. Chinese thinkers such as Sun Tzu once praised Go as a school of war and life. More than just a game of intelligence, Go is also associated with the ideas of yin and yang balance and the operation of nature. Go players do not simply score points, but also learn how to maintain harmony in conflict. In the ancient world of South America, the Inca Empire developed a unique form of the game, known through records and archaeological remains, the game called Patoli. Patoli is a board game based on a combination of luck and strategy, popular among Mesoamerican tribes, including the Incas and their neighbors. The board is usually made up of cross-shaped or diagonal lines with small pieces moving based on the tossing of seeds or sticks. Players bet with seeds, jewels, or even land. This makes Patoli a game associated with fate and fortune, similar to a ritual of testing one's luck. Patoli is more than just entertainment. It was a way for the Incas to demonstrate social status, perseverance, and the relationship between humans and the gods. Finally, in ancient Korea, a game called Ute Nori has also become an integral part of folklore. Ute Nori is a popular folk game during traditional festivals. A square board with squares arranged in a cross pattern, with 4 wooden sticks thrown to determine the number of moves. The game requires a combination of strategy and luck, and is usually played in groups of 2 to 4 people. Each move can bring advantages or pitfalls, creating moments of suspense and connecting families and communities. Ute Nori also symbolizes the will and solidarity in the daily struggles and activities of Koreans, reflecting the philosophy of yin and yang and the balance of life. From Egypt, Greece, Rome to India, China, South America, and North Asia, ancient games were more than just entertainment. They were reflections of worldviews, religions, and survival tactics, and served as a bridge between humans and gods, destiny, and community. In India, Pachisi further demonstrates this, as the game is not simply a race of 4 pieces around a cross-shaped board, but a blend of luck strategy and divine providence. Players move their pieces based on the roll of 6 or 7 cowrie shells, with the number of faces revealed determining the move. Each move is both a human decision and an interaction with the will of the gods. In particular, when your piece touches an opponent's piece, you can knock them back to their starting point, creating thrilling moments that require patience and meticulous calculation. This way of playing mirrors real life, where every decision can lead to success or failure, and perseverance and patience are often rewarded. Emperor Akbar the Great built a giant version of Pachisi at Fatehpur Sikri, with real players dressed in colorful costumes transforming into chess pieces and moving under the king's control. It was not just a game, but also a political performance ritual and symbol of power. Pachisi symbolizes the intersection of dharma, duty, karma, action, moksha, liberation, and profound moral values, as a lesson in the balance between risk and restraint, between destiny and free will. Moving to China, the game of Weiqi, or Go, is also considered the art of war and philosophy. The vast board, with 361 points, 19 symbolizes a complex world where players need to understand the balance between forces and perseverance to maintain control. Go has no element of luck. Each move must rely on deep tactical calculation, observation, and prediction of the player. The game became a means of training thinking and demonstrating knowledge valued by the nobility philosophers and strategists, such as Sun Tzu. In Latin America, the Aztec and Inca empires had the game Patoli, a combination of board game gambling and religious ritual. Patoli is played on a cross-shaped board of 52 squares, corresponding to the 52-year cycle of the Aztec calendar. Players throw beans to decide their moves and try to run around the board before their opponents. However, the game also has a ceremonial nature where players bet with valuable assets, such as food gold or even slaves. Patoli is also believed to be played under the supervision of the gods, especially Mictlantecutli, the god of games, dance, and rage. The game reflects the struggle between order and chaos, luck and destiny. In the ancient Korean peninsula, Ute Nori is still an indispensable part of folk life. The Ute Nori board, with its cross shape and 4 wooden sticks thrown up, creates a mixture of luck and strategy, becoming an occasion for family reunions during traditional holidays. The game is not only for entertainment, but also helps strengthen social relationships, team spirit, and learn the art of strategy in life. Through these civilizations, it can be seen that games are not only for fun, but also a way for people to express their concepts of the universe, society, gods, and destiny. From Indian Pachisi, Chinese Go, Aztec Patoli, to Korean Ute Nori, each game bears the deep cultural and spiritual imprint of its time. Education and warcraft can't be overstated. Games like Ludus Latrunalorum and Tafel weren't just distractions for soldiers. They were tactical simulations. Emperors, generals, and young nobles played them not just to win, but to learn. Games trained the mind to anticipate moves, counter threats, and balance aggression with strategy. They forged leaders in silence away from the battlefield. So whether they were rolled in temples, chanted in courts, or carved into stone, ancient games served multiple roles. They amused, yes, but they also taught, healed, judged, and prepared. They connected humans to the divine players, to fate and time to eternity. In the ancient world, when you sat down to play, you weren't escaping life. You were living it deeper. Mary Wollstonecraft. Godwin entered the world on August 30th, 1797, with more pressure in her first breath than most feel in a lifetime. She was born into an intellectual earthquake. Her parents, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, were two of the most radical thinkers of their time. Her mother was the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Women, a fiery feminist treatise that dared to argue women were rational beings worthy of education and equality. Her father was a political philosopher and novelist who rejected monarchy, organized religion, and traditional marriage. Together, they formed one of the most revolutionary unions in Enlightenment England. And then 11 days after Mary's birth, her mother died. From the beginning, Mary's life was marked by brilliance and loss. Raised by the father in a house filled with books, ideas, and visiting radicals, she grew up surrounded by the ghost of a mother she never knew, but whose voice rang through the pages of her writing. Her father did not hide these works. He encouraged Mary to read them. Her education was anything but ordinary. She absorbed Greek myths, science, poetry, philosophy, and history before most children had learned to write a paragraph. The garden became her classroom. Her thoughts were fed by the likes of Cage Rousseau and Voltaire, but the household was far from idyllic. William Godwin eventually remarried, and Mary's relationship with her stepmother, Mary Jane Clairmont, was cold and contentious. The new Mrs. Godwin favored her own children and viewed Mary as a moody, defiant girl with too much imagination. Mary, for her part, despised the domestic expectations placed on her and found solace only in writing and dreaming. By age 10, she was scribbling her own stories. By 14, she was reading books most adults would fear to touch. She was not a girl built for embroidery and tea. She was a storm quietly gathering strength. Mary's childhood, framed by the ideals of political revolution, personal freedom, and feminist rebellion, laid the foundation for a life unlike any other. Her origins were haunted by death, defined by genius, and forged in fire. She was not simply her parents' daughter. She was already becoming something stranger and far more powerful. Mary Shelley, the future mother of science fiction. In the summer of 1814, Mary Godwin, just 16 years old, did something that would ignite scandal across literary London. She ran away, but not alone. She eloped with the already married, wildly idealistic poet, Percy Bysshe Shelley, a man 5 years her senior who was both her father's admirer and his greatest disappointment. What began as a romantic rebellion would soon unravel into grief, exile, and artistic fire. Mary met Percy in her father's home, where the poet often visited to debate philosophy and pay homage to Godwin's writings. But it was Mary, not her father, who enchanted him. Quiet yet intense, she shared Percy's fascination with liberty, science, and the supernatural. They read together by her mother's grave in St. Pancras churchyard, where she would often retreat to be near the woman she'd never known. It was there between headstones and candle-lit books that their love story began. Their departure was abrupt and reckless. Mary Percy and Mary's stepsister Claire Claremont left England and sailed across the Channel to France, with barely a change of clothes and no clear plan. Percy abandoned his pregnant wife Harriet, a decision that would haunt all of them. The trio wandered through revolutionary France and Switzerland on foot, writing in their journals by day and sleeping in flea-bitten inns by night. Their money ran out quickly, forcing them back to England in disgrace. What followed was a spiral of hardship. Percy's creditors hounded them. Mary's father, once the voice of free love, shunned her, and the children began to die. Mary gave birth to a daughter who died within weeks. "Dream that my little baby came to life again," she wrote in her journal. Awake and find no baby. Grief had entered her bloodstream, and it never left. Yet through the turbulence, Mary's mind sharpened. She was reading voraciously Greek myths, alchemy, galvanism, scientific theories about reanimation. She was living in exile, a radical woman in a conservative world. Her relationship with Percy was both intoxicating and exhausting. He was brilliant, erratic, emotionally distant, yet passionately supportive of her writing. Mary Shelley had become an outcast, but she was no victim. Her life, already overflowing with rebellion and heartbreak, was laying the groundwork for something extraordinary. And in just a few short years, on the shores of Lake Geneva, lightning would strike. In the summer of 1816, Mary Godwin, now Mary Shell, found herself at the heart of one of literary history's most infamous vacations. She was in Switzerland, staying at the Villa Diodati by Lake Geneva, with her lover Percy Shelley, her stepsister Claire Claremont, the notorious Lord Byron, and Byron's physician John Polidori. The weather was miserable thanks to the eruption of Mount Tambora the year before. The skies were choked with ash, crops failed, temperatures dropped. It became known as the year without a summer. Trapped indoors, the group passed the time telling ghost stories and discussing science, poetry, and philosophy. One night, Byron proposed a challenge. Each person should write their own supernatural tale. A creative storm began to brew, one that would change literature forever. Mary was just 18. Byron and Shell were already celebrated poets. Polidori would go on to write The Vampire, a precursor to Dracula. But it was Mary, quiet and observant, who would shatter expectations. At first, she struggled to come up with an idea. Days passed. Then, during a conversation about galvanism, the use of electricity to reanimate dead tissue, something clicked. That night, Mary had a vision. In her words, "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out. She had dreamed of a scientist and the monster he brought to life. Thus was born Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus." The novel wasn't just horror. It was a fusion of science, myth, and grief. Victor Frankenstein's obsession with creating life mirrored the Ag's fascination with scientific progress. The creature, shunned and unloved, reflected Mary's own feelings of abandonment and otherness. Themes of parenthood, isolation, and guilt bled onto every page, drawn from her losses and the chaotic men around her. When Frankenstein was published in 1818, it was anonymous. Many assumed Percy had written it. He had penned the preface. He was the husband, He was the man. But the truth couldn't stay hidden. The world would come to know Mary Shelley not only as the wife of a poet, but as the mother of science fiction. In one summer, she had taken lightning death and her own sorrow and made a monster that would never die. After the birth of Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's life didn't settle into literary triumph. Instead, it plunged deeper into sorrow. Death had always circled her, but in the years following 1818 it closed in relentlessly. Even as her creation began to walk in the public imagination, her own family began to vanish. Mary and Percy returned to England, where grief struck again. Their two young children, Clara Ara and William, both died. Clara Ara from dysentery in Italy, William from malaria shortly after. Mary was devastated. She had now lost 3 children in as many years. The pain was bottomless. She wrote, "I am not now in a state to be comforted." She isolated herself, her mind darkened by nightmares, and her health began to deteriorate. Yet amidst the sorrow, a glimmer of life emerged. In 1819, she gave birth to her only surviving child, Percy Florence Shelley. He would become her anchor in the years to come. But even he could not shield her from the next blow. In 1822, tragedy struck again. This time brutally and suddenly, Percy Shelley drowned in a storm while sailing off the coast of Italy. His body washed ashore unrecognizable, except for a volume of Keats's poetry in his pocket. Mary was just 24 years old, widowed, broke, and emotionally shattered. She had lived through the deaths of 3 children, her half-sister Fan's suicide, the suicide of Percy's arranged wife Harriet, and now the drowning of the love of her life. It was a Gothic horror no fiction could rival, yet somehow she endured. Mary gathered Percy's remains, both literal and literary. She preserved his poems, his reputation, and even allegedly kept a piece of his calcified heart, wrapped in silk, stored in her writing desk. Grief was no longer just a companion. It was her constant muse, and through it all, she kept writing. Her pen became her lifeline. She composed Valperga, a historical novel, The Last Man, a post-apocalyptic vision of plague and isolation that eerily mirrored her own desolation. And she edited and published Percy's works, ensuring his legacy wouldn't drown with him. Mary Shelley didn't just survive tragedy, she absorbed it, transformed it, and turned it into art. Love had defined her early years, but now loss would shape her myth. By the mid-1820s, Mary Shelley was alone in a way few young women of her era could imagine. At just 28, she had already buried most of the people she had loved. Her parents, her children, her half-sister, her husband. What remained was her pen, her son Percy Florence, and the crushing weight of legacy. She was no longer the radical teenager who fled England for love. She was now a widow, a single mother, and a woman surrounded by ghosts. And yet, she endured. Financially unstable, Mary relied on her writing to survive. But Victorian society wasn't kind to women who had lived too much. She was judged not only as a female author, but as the scandalous wife of a controversial poet. Publishers wanted her to be palatable, respectable. So she learned to navigate the literary world with care, balancing her radical past with the need to provide a stable life for her son. She wrote tirelessly novels like Perkin Warbeck, Lodore, and Fulner, each weaving themes of political exile, lost mothers, and moral conflict. They weren't as revolutionary as Frankenstein, but they reflected her evolving perspective. Less idealistic, more grounded, and deeply introspective. She also produced biographies, travel journals, and countless editorial projects, including the monumental task of preserving and promoting Percy Shelley's poetry. She shaped his legacy with the same diligence she once used to shape her stories. But Mary wasn't simply a caretaker of memories. She remained intellectually sharp, politically engaged, and fiercely protective of her privacy. She rejected multiple marriage proposals. She refused to publish gossip or expose secrets. She maintained friendships with writers, philosophers, and publishers, but trusted very few. Her greatest devotion was to her son Percy Florence. She ensured he received the best education, protected him from scandal, and gave him the quiet life she herself had been denied. In doing so, she created a version of stability that had eluded her for decades. Mary's later life was marked by physical illness, recurring headaches, and paralysis in her right arm. But she never stopped writing, never stopped thinking, never stopped being the woman who had stared down grief and defied it with ink and paper. She was the last woman standing not untouched by tragedy, but undefeated by it. Her life was no longer just a Gothic novel. It was an act of endurance. By the time Mary Shelley reached her 30s, she had become a quiet force in the literary world. Not through loud acclaim, but through sheer persistence. She was no longer merely Percy Shelley's widow or the daughter of famous radicals. She was Mary Shelley, the author of Frankenstein, a novel that over time had begun to take on a strange life of its own. Frankenstein had first been dismissed by critics. Some saw it as a disturbing oddity. Others assumed it had been written by her husband, but the public couldn't look away. By the 1830s, the story had already begun evolving beyond the page. Theater adaptations sprang up across Europe, including The Popular Presumption or The Fate of Frankenstein, which portrayed the creature as a mute brute far from Mary's eloquent, tragic original. Still, it proved the novel's cultural power. Her monster was no longer just hers. It belonged to the world. And with that came something extraordinary. A new genre was beginning to form. Frankenstein had unknowingly birthed science fiction. Long before Jules Verne and H.G. Wells' Mary Shelley had asked the terrifying question, what happens when man plays God? She had fused Gothic horror with Enlightenment-era science threading human tragedy through speculative imagination. It wasn't just a horror story, it was a warning. Mary herself didn't claim to have invented a genre. In fact, she rarely called attention to herself at all. But scholars now regard her as the mother of science fiction, a title she earned not through intention, but innovation. She had taken the anxieties of her era about science, morality, motherhood, and death, and molded them into a timeless parable. As she edited Percy's works and navigated the male-dominated publishing world, Mary quietly influenced generations of thinkers. Her writings explored not only politics and feminism, but ecological disaster, existential dread, and ethical boundaries. Her 1826 novel, The Last Man, imagined a world ravaged by plague and loneliness, a vision that would only be fully appreciated a century later. Though ill for much of her later life, she never stopped engaging with the world through her writing. Her legacy was already in motion, creeping out of the lab, across the stage, through the press, and into the bloodstream of modern culture. Mary Shelley had breathed life into an idea that would never die. And for that, literature would never be the same. Mary Shelley's life was shaped not only by love and loss, but by identity, an identity she was constantly forced to defend, reshape, and preserve. Being a woman writer in the 19th century was already a political act. Being Mary Shelley, the daughter of revolutionaries, the widow of a radical poet, and the creator of a morally complex monster, made her existence even more loaded. After Percy's death, Mary was left in a precarious position. Though she had taken his surname through their marriage, her status as his literary executive and the guardian of his legacy was not guaranteed. His family, the aristocratic Shelleys, had never approved of Mary. They viewed her with suspicion, considered her dangerous, and offered her a meager allowance on the condition that she stay out of their affairs. They allowed her to raise her son, but not to speak too freely. Mary played a long and careful game. She towed the line between respectability and rebellion, crafting a public persona that was quiet, literary, and maternal, while still protecting her radical lineage beneath the surface. When editing Percy's poetry and writing his memoirs, she subtly sanitized his atheism and revolutionary views, ensuring that his works could reach a wider, more conservative Victorian audience. Critics have debated this move for decades. Was it betrayal or strategy? Perhaps it was both. Mary understood the politics of reputation better than most. But while she worked to preserve Percy's legacy, she also fought for her own. Publishers wanted her to be silent, anonymous, or at best the footnote to her husband's genius. Mary refused. She continued writing novels under her own name. In an era when women were still publishing under male pseudonyms, Mary Shell insisted on visibility. At the same time, she quietly inserted political themes into her fiction. In Lower and Fulner, she explored issues of female autonomy, flawed fatherhood, and the social limitations placed on women. In The Last Man, she imagined the collapse of civilization and the futility of empire, hardly subtle commentary. Mary Shell's pen was not just a creative tool, it was a weapon. Through fiction biography and quiet editorial work, she shaped not only the memory of a generation, but the framework of modern literature. As the Victorian era bloomed around her, Mary Shell entered her final decade with a quiet dignity shadowed by physical decline and emotional isolation. Though she was still recognized for her intellect and literary contributions, the world that had once swirled with radicalism and romanticism was fading, and Mary was one of its last living witnesses. The vibrant Siri of her youth, Byron Percy Clare, even her father William Godwin were gone. The revolutionary fire of the early 1800s had given way to Victorian restraint. Mary found herself increasingly alone, burdened by chronic illness. She suffered from debilitating headaches, partial paralysis in her arms, and what may have been a recurring brain tumor. Yet she rarely complained. Her pain was simply folded into her routine like ink into paper. Still, she remained committed to her son, Percy Florence Shell, who had grown into a beautiful and affectionate young man. Unlike his parents, Percy Florence lived a conventional life, eventually inheriting the baronets he denied to his father. Mary clung to his companionship, focusing her remaining energy on ensuring his success and protecting him from scandal, especially the ghosts that still followed the Shelley name. Though her days of bold creation were behind her, Mary kept working. She maintained correspondence with publishers, friends, and fellow intellectuals. She continued reading widely history, science, political theory, remaining intellectually engaged, even as her body betrayed her. She kept editing Percy's works, carefully curating his poetic legacy, while tiptoeing around the more incendiary pieces to preserve public favor. But the shadows never fully lifted. She lived modestly sometimes on the edge of poverty and never remarried. Marriage to Mary was never about security. It had been about passion and shared ideals. No one else could fill the space Percy had occupied, nor would she allow them to try. In 1851, at the age of 53, Mary Shell died of what was likely a brain tumor. She passed quietly, surrounded by her son and his wife. After her death, they found among her belongings locks of hair from her lost children and the rumored piece of Percy Shell's heart wrapped in silk. Even in death, Mary Shell remained the keeper of memory. A woman shaped by loss, elevated by genius, and driven to write through every shadow. Mary Shell died in 1851, but her voice never went silent. In the decades that followed her work, especially, Frankenstein grew beyond her wildest imagination. What began as a ghost story by a teenage runaway became one of the most influential novels in human history. Mary Shell wasn't just remembered, she was resurrected again and again. At first, her fame lingered quietly. During her lifetime, she had been praised mostly for her loyalty to Percy and her editorship of his poetry. Her own fiction, though respected, was often dismissed or misunderstood. Frankenstein was still seen as a curiosity filed under Gothic horror, its deeper themes ignored by a world not yet ready to question science, morality, and man's place in the universe. But time revealed her genius. By the 20th century, Mary's monster had become a cultural icon. Film adaptations beginning with the silent era and exploding with Universal's 1931 Frankenstein, starring Boris Karloff, gave her creation a new face. Literally, the creature became a misunderstood symbol of modern anxiety, a tragic being forged by human arrogance and cast out by society. Each adaptation reflected the fears of its time. War technology, nuclear power, artificial intelligence, and always at the core, Mary Shell's fingerprints. Scholars began to revisit her work with new eyes. Feminist critics championed her not just as the wife of a poet, but as a literary architect in her own right. They explored her insights into motherhood, grief, creation, and power. The Last Man Once Overlooked was reevaluated as an early dystopian masterpiece. Her life itself, marked by rebellion, intellect, and endurance, became as fascinating as her fiction. Today, Mary Shell is not just remembered, she is revered. She is called the mother of science fiction, the queen of Gothic literature, a pioneer who fused the personal with the philosophical. Her legacy lives on in classrooms, laboratories, film studios, and political discourse. Whenever we ask what it means to be human, or what happens when creation outruns conscience, we're speaking in her language. She gave us a monster. But in doing so, she gave voice to every outsider, every orphaned idea, every mind cast out for being too curious. Mary Shell didn't just write a novel. She rewired literature's DNA.